So as we enter week 3 of our class, we kind of get down to what will really be the business of this class, and that is doing a lot of writing, different sorts, looking at materials and doing little readings. Next week I'll be asking you to watch a film. There's an alternative assignment because of the nature of the film. But essentially every week we'll be looking at some source material, usually readings, and doing some writing about them. And so really, essentially, for the rest of the class you got a bunch of writing assignments you need to do. But this is a class called Critical Reasoning, and that's what I'll be asking you to do, which is typical of expository writing. This is what you do as a student. You write papers, you think about things, you form arguments, you assess the arguments of others using your own arguments. This is what we do. But this class is explicitly about reasoning, and what you're asked to do this week is to evaluate Socrates' reasoning. We have a claim that we start with. This is from a longer dialogue called the Meno, and it's called the Meno because Socrates is talking to a man named Meno about the nature of virtue, which is a kind of a complicated word. I don't think we need to get too far into that. After all, it's not really a class in ethics. It's about the form of arguments, really, and so we start with a claim about virtue, about Meno's claim about what virtue is, a definition of virtue. And what follows is a very brief but interesting criticism on the part of Socrates of that claim. So really all you're being asked to do is to assess the success of Socrates' criticism of that claim. Very simple assignment, really, a brief essay, 500 words. But what you have to sort of do here, and what you'll have to do progressively as the course goes on, is to be very clear about what you're writing about. And in the context of this class, to be clear about what you're writing about is to be clear about what the arguments are. This is not a particularly difficult, and it's certainly a very short reading. But one of the things you need to do to write a successful essay here, in which you evaluate Socrates' critique of Meno's definition of virtue, is to be very clear about what is being said. What is Meno's definition? And what are the objections? Because frankly, we're not giving anything away when we say that Socrates has objections to Meno's definition. What are Socrates' objections and what is his argument? So what you need to do is really you need to rewrite the thing. Not just in your essay, but I think to get started, you have to be very clear about what exactly is being said. Meno starts with a certain claim, certain definition of virtue. Socrates, part of what he does certainly is dialectical in that sense that we were introduced to last week. What are the implications of that claim? That is, okay, you've made a claim, and it may or may not be true, but let's find out whether we think it's true or not. And really, the method there is to say, well, if this claim were true, what would be the implications of it? And are those implications acceptable? There is a certain conclusion to this whole little thing that Socrates does. That is, if your definition of virtue is correct, then it has a certain implication. And are we willing to accept that implication? Is that implication something which is reasonable and sensible or not? If it's not reasonable and sensible, that is, if the implication of your claim, of your definition, is not something that we would want to accept, then we probably don't want to accept the initial claim, the initial definition. So my advice to you in approaching this assignment, which again is just a little expository essay, really answer the question. You're critiquing Socrates' critique here. You're assessing his assessment. But my advice is, before you even start writing the essay, take pen to paper and write out exactly what the argument is. What is it that Meno says virtue is? And then what is Socrates' analysis of that. What does he say in response? Try to, I mean, I'm not saying there's exactly one way to do it, but it's pretty clear that Socrates makes a few points, and they're there. But to do that first, to lay out, well, what do I think is going on here? And the only way to do that really with any clarity is to write it out. And that ultimately is what your grasp of what Socrates is doing here is crucial, because you're being asked to say, well, does he really? I don't know. I wouldn't go far as to say refute Meno's definition of virtue, but is he successful in his criticism? Because he certainly thinks there's something wrong with that. He certainly thinks that it's probably not true. So that technique, in a way, some critical reasoning classes, that's all the class is teaching students a method for analyzing arguments. That is, using little arrows and numbers, and it's actually quite useful to do, but it's incredibly boring, and ultimately probably not worth it. I think I've done it, so I speak. I know of what I speak, I think. But that is something you'll just simply have to do, train yourself to do, is to read something and then try to break it down into its essentials in terms of what the argument is. This is pretty short reading here, so that work is more or less been done for you by Plato, the author of this dialogue. In further readings, you're going to be reading things that are a lot longer, and in which the work of actually setting down what somebody's argument is and then evaluating it is going to be a little harder. So we'll start with something. It's a very interesting thing. It's a very famous part of Plato's philosophy, at least part of it, and a very famous Socratic doctrine about virtue and whether people ever really want things that are bad, or desire things that are bad, or whether we always desire things that are good. Very famous thing in Plato's Ethics, or Socratic Ethics. So it's an interesting thing. It's not that complex, and but it's a way to get started. So we really want to be clear. What is the argument here? What is Socrates' argument here? And then once you have a firm grasp of that, then you're in a position to form your own argument about his argument.